An Essay on the Generative Principle of Political Constitutions by Joseph deMaistre, published 1809. One of the gravest errors of a century which embraced them all was to believe that a political constitution could be written and created a priori, whereas reason and experience agree that such a constitution is a divine work and that it is precisely the most fundamental and essentially constitutional elements in a nation's law that cannot be written. Frenchmen have often asked as a joke in what book the Salic Law was written, but Jerome Bignon replied exactly to the point, very probably without understanding how aptly, that it was written in the hearts of Frenchmen. Indeed, supposing that a law of this importance exists only because it is written, it is certainly that whatever authority has written it will have the right to annul it. The law would not therefore have that aura of sanctity and immutability that distinguishes truly constitutional laws. The essence of a fundamental law is that no one has the right to abolish it. But how is it beyond human power if it has been made by someone? The agreement of a people is impossible, and even if it were, an agreement is not a law, and obliges no one unless there is a superior authority guaranteeing it. Locke sought the characteristic of law in the expression of combined wills, an unlucky chance to choose the precise characteristic that excludes the idea of law. As a matter of fact, combined wills form a settlement, and not a law, which necessarily and obviously presupposes a superior will enforcing obedience. In the Hobbesian system, which has been so successful in our day under the pen of Locke, the authority of civil laws derives solely from a contract. But if there is no natural law which obliges men to carry out the laws that have been made, of what use are they? Promises, engagements, and oaths are mere words. It is as easy to break these weak links as to forge them. Without the dogma of a law-giving God, all moral obligation is chimerical. On the one hand, power, on the other, powerlessness. This is the only bond uniting human societies. What a wise and profound theologian has said here of moral obligation applies with equal force to political or civil obligation. Law is properly law, and has a genuine sanction only if it is taken as emanating from a superior will, so that its essential feature is that it is not the will of all. Otherwise, laws would, as has been said, be only settlements, and, as the author just quoted added, those who have been free to make contracts have not renounced the power of revoking them, and their descendants, who played no part in them, are still less bound to observe them. Consequently, primordial good sense, happily anterior to sophisms, has everywhere sought the sanction for laws in a power above men, either by recognizing that sovereignty derives from God, or by reversing certain unwritten laws of God's word. The editors of Roman laws have included in the first chapter of their collection a very remarkable fragment of Greek jurisprudence. Among the laws which govern us, says the passage, some are written, others are not. Nothing could be simpler and nothing more profound. Is there any Turkish law expressly permitting the sovereign to send a man to his death immediately without the intermediate decision of a court? Is there any written law, even a religious one, which forbids this to the sovereign Christian in Europe? Yet the Turk is no more surprised to see his ruler order the immediate execution than it is to see him go to the mosque. Like all of Asia, even all of antiquity, he believes that the immediate power of life and death is a legitimate appendage of sovereignty. But our kings shudder at the very idea of condemning a man to death, for in our eyes such a condemnation would be a vile murder, and yet I doubt if it would be possible to forbid them this power, though a written fundamental law without it leading to greater evils than those which one wished to prevent. The search in Roman history for an answer to the question of what were precisely the powers of the Senate will be unsuccessful, at least in establishing any exact limits to this power. It is easy to see in general that the powers of the populace and of the Senate balanced each other, and that they never ceased to struggle against each other. It is clear that patriotism or lassitude, feebleness or violence ended their dangerous battles, but we do not know more than this. Witnessing these great scenes of history, one sometimes feels tempted to believe that things would have gone much better if there had been precise laws circumscribing these powers. But this would be very wrong. Laws like this, forever endangered by unforeseen cases and unlikely exceptions, would not have lasted 6 months, or would have undermined the Republic itself. The English Constitution is an example nearer to us, and consequently more striking. If examined closely, it can be seen that it works only by not working, if this play on words is excused. It maintains itself only by exceptions. Habeas corpus, for example, has been suspended so often and for such long periods that it could be argued that the exception has become the entirety of the rule. Suppose for a moment that the authors of this famous act had attempted to lay down the cases when it could be suspended. They would have, by that deed, destroyed it. In spite of this, we are still told of written constitutions and constitutional laws made a priori. It is impossible to conceive how a rational man can believe in such chimeras. If any scheme was carried through in England to give the cabinet a formal constitution status by law, and thus to regulate and circumscribe rigorously its privileges and powers, together with the precarious necessity to limit its influence and prevent it from abusing it, the state would be undermined. The real English constitution is the public spirit, admirable, unique, infallible, and above praise, which leads, conserves, and protects all. What is written is nothing. At the end of the last century, loud complaints were made about a statesman who conceived the idea of introducing this same English constitution, or what went under the name, into a convulsed kingdom that was demanding any constitution, whatever, with a kind of madness. If you like, he was wrong, so far at least as one can be wrong, when acting in good faith, which it is reasonable to suppose he was, and I believe wholeheartedly. But who then has the right to condemn him? Vel duo, vel nemo. He did not assert a wish to destroy anything of his own authority. He wanted only, he said, to substitute something which seemed to him to be reasonable for something that was no longer wanted, and that even by that fact no longer existed. Moreover, if the principle is accepted, as in fact it was, that a man can create a constitution, this minister, who was certainly a man, had the right to create his as much as anyone else, and more than some. Was opinion at all divided at this point? Was it not everywhere believed that a constitution is as much a work of imagination as an ode or a tragedy? Has not Paine asserted with a profundity that enraptured the universities that a constitution does not exist if one cannot put it in one's pocket? The 18th century, which questioned nothing, had no doubts of itself. That is the rule. And I do not believe that it produced a single youth of any talent whatever who had not made 3 things by the time he had left school: a new system of education, a constitution, and a society. If, therefore, a mature and talented man, deeply versed in economics and contemporary philosophy, had undertaken only the second of these projects, this in itself would have convinced me of his extreme moderation. But I must admit that he seems to me to be a veritable prodigy of wisdom and modesty when putting experience, at least as he saw it, in place of foolish theories. He humbly demanded a constitution of the English model instead of drawing one up himself. It will be said that even this was not possible. I agree, but he did not know this, and how could he have known? Who was there who could have told him? The more you examine the part human action plays in the formation of political constitutions, the clearer it becomes that it is effective only in an extremely subordinate role or a simple instrument. And I do not believe that any doubt at all remains of the incontrovertible truth of the following propositions. 1. That the fundamentals of political constitutions exist before written laws. 2. That a constitutional law is and can be only the development or the sanction of a pre-existent and unwritten right. 3. That the most essential and most intrinsically constitutional, and the really fundamental, is not written, and even should not be if the state is not to be imperiled. 4. That the weakness and fragility of a constitution is in direct relationship to the number of written constitutional articles. We are misled on this point by a fallacy so natural that it entirely escapes our attention. Because a man acts, he believes he acts by himself, and because he is conscious of his liberty, he forgets his dependence. As far as the physical order is concerned, he listens to reason. And although he can, for example, plant an acorn, water it, and so on, he is incapable of admitting that he does not make oaks, since he sees that the tree grows and perfects itself without human interference, and that, moreover, he has not made the acorn. But in some social order in which he is a participant and actor, he begins to believe that he is really the direct author of everything that happens. Through him, in a sense, the trowel believes himself to be the architect. Doubtless, man is intelligent, free, and sublime, but he is nonetheless an implement of God. Nothing is better known than Cicero's simile on the subject of the Epicurean system, which wished to construct a world with atoms moving haphazardly in a vacuum. It is more credible that letters thrown into the air could arrange themselves on falling so as to form a poem. This idea has been repeated in praise thousands of times, yet I know of no one who has thought yet of supplying the missing corollary. Suppose that printing type thrown by the handful from the top of a tower fell to the earth to form Rachin's Athalie. What could be the conclusion? That some intelligence had governed the fall and the arrangement of the type. No other conclusion could be sensibly reached. Consider now any political constitution whatever, that of England, for example. Certainly it has not been made a priori. Never have statesmen gathered together and said, "Let us create 3 powers, balance them in such a manner," and so on. No one has thought this. The Constitution is the work of circumstances, and the number of these circumstances is infinite. Roman, ecclesiastical, feudal law, Saxon, Norman, and Danish customs. Every kind of class privilege, prejudice, and ambition, wars, revolts, revolutions, conquests, and crusades, all the virtues, vices, sciences, errors, and passions, all these elements acting together and forming by their intermixture and interaction, endlessly multiplying combinations, have finally produced, after many centuries, the most complex unity and the most delicate equilibrium of political forces the world has ever known. However, these elements, so cast into space, have fallen into such a meaningful order without a single man among the multitude who have acted on this huge stage knowing what relation his actions had with the whole scheme of things, or what future was to be. It follows that these elements were guided in their fall by an unerring hand superior to man. Perhaps the greatest folly of a century of follies was to believe that fundamental laws could be written a priori, whereas they are obviously the work of a power above men. And the very act of writing them down later on is the surest sign that their real force has gone. It is very remarkable that God, having deigned to speak to men, has himself made these truths clear in 2 revelations which we owe to his goodness. A very clever man to my mind, one of the most outstanding of our age, because of the bitter struggle revealed in his writings between the most terrible prejudices of the age, of sect, of habit, and the purest intentions, the most righteous sentiments, the most sensitive understanding. This man has decided that a teaching coming direct from God or given solely on his command must have been man's first assurance of the existence of this being. The truth is precisely the opposite, because the prime characteristic of this teaching is not to reveal directly either the existence or the attributes of God, but to presuppose the whole of his knowledge, without our understanding why or how. Thus it does not tell us, there is or you will believe in only one God, eternal, omnipotent, and so on. It says, and these are its first words, in a purely narrative form, in the beginning God created, by which it supposes that this dogma is known before its writing. Let us pass on to Christianity, the greatest of all imagined institutions, since it is entirely the work of God and has made for all men in all ages. We will find it subject to the general law. To be sure, its divine author could very well himself have written or have had things written, yet he did neither, at least in legislative form. The New Testament, coming after the death of the legislator and even after the establishment of his religion, offers a narrative, warnings, moral precepts, exhortations, orders, threats, and so on, but certainly not a collection of dogma set out in an imperative form. In telling the story of the Last Supper, when God loved us up to the end, the evangelists had a good opportunity to direct our belief by writing. However, they refrained from declaring or ordaining anything. It is well said in this splendid story, "Go forth and teach." but not teach this or that. If the scriptural historian sets out a dogma, it is simply as something already known. The creeds which have since appeared are professions of faith, which serve to collect our thoughts or to contradict momentary errors. We read there, "we believe," and not "you believe." We recite them as individuals. We sing them in church, on lyre and organ, as real prayers, since they are forms of submission, confidence and faith addressed to God, and not orders addressed to men. It would be very amusing to hear the Confessions of Augsburg or the 39 Articles set to music. Far from the first creeds containing a statement of all our dogmas, on the contrary, Christians of those days would have regarded it as a serious crime to state them at all. The name is true of the Holy Scriptures. No idea has been more mistaken than the attempt to find in them the whole of Christian dogma. There is not a single line in those writings which lays down or even hints at a plan to construct a code or a dogmatic declaration of all articles of faith. Moreover, if a people possesses one of these codes of belief, three things are certain. 1. That the religion of his people is false. 2. That it has written out its religious code in a bout of fever. 3. That in a little while it will be made fun of, even in this nation, and that it can have neither power nor durance, such as, for example, the famous Articles, which are signed more than they are read, and read more than they are believed. Not only does this list of dogmas count for nothing, or very nearly in the country of its birth, but besides it is evident to a foreigner that the illustrious possessors of this piece of paper find it nothing but an embarrassment. They would like very much to see it go, since it irritates the national good sense enlightened by time, and since it recalls to them an unhappy beginning. But the Constitution is written. Doubtless these same Englishmen would have never demanded the Great Charter if the nation's rights had not been violated. But also, they would have never demanded it if these rights had not existed before the Charter. It is as true of the Church as of the state. If Christianity had never been attacked, it would have never been written out as its dogma in order to determine it. But also dogma has never been determined by writing unless it existed previously in its natural state, which is the spoken word. The true authors of the Council of Trent were two great reformers of the 16th century. Their followers, more calm now, have since proposed to us that we delete this fundamental law because it contains some words difficult for them to accept, and they have tried to tempt us by showing us that this is the price for a reunion, which would make us accomplices rather than friends. But this request is neither theologically nor philosophically justified. They themselves formally brought into the language of religion these words which weary them. Let us hope that they learn today to pronounce them. Faith, if sophistical opposition had never forced it to write, would be 1,000 times more angelic. It weeps over these decisions that revolt has forced it to make, and that were always unfortunate, since they presuppose doubt or attack, and could have been required only in the midst of the most dangerous upheavals. The state of war elevated venerable ramparts around the truth. They doubtless protect it, but they hide it. They make it unassailable, but at the same time less accessible. This is not what truth, which would like to clasp humanity in its arms, asks for. I have talked of Christianity as a system of belief. I am now going to consider it as a sovereign power. In its most numerous associations, there it is monarchical, as everyone knows. And this must be so, since by the very nature of things, monarchy becomes the most necessary as the association becomes more numerous. It has not been forgotten that the impure mouth has nevertheless brought itself into favor nowadays. When it said that France was geometrically monarchical, it would be indeed difficult to express more happily and more unshakable truth. But if the extent of France of itself excludes any kind of government, for greater reason that sovereignty, which by the very nature of its constitution will always have subjects on every point of the globe, cannot be other than monarchical, and experience reinforces theory on this point. That being granted, it might be thought that the prerogatives of the head of such a monarchy would be more rigorously determined and circumscribed than any others. This, however, is the opposite to what has taken place. If you read innumerable books spawned by external attacks, and even by a kind of civil war, which has its advantages as well as disadvantages, you will see that they base their arguments on fact, and it is very remarkable that the Supreme Tribunal has continually allowed disputes over the question that presents itself to every mind as the most fundamental in the Constitution without ever having wished to settle it by formal law, which must be so, if I am not greatly mistaken, precisely because the fundamental importance of the question. These ideas, taken in their general aspects, are not foreign to the philosophers of antiquity. They well understood the weakness, I almost said the nullity, of writing in the great institutions, but no one has better seen or expressed this truth than Plato, who is always the first on the path to all great truths. According to him, first of all, the man who owes all of his education to written discourses has always just the appearance of wisdom. The spoken word, he adds, is to writing what a man is to his portrait. The creations of the painter strike us as being lifelike, yet if you question them, they preserve a solemn silence. It is the same with a book, which does not know what to say to one man or to hide from another. If it is attacked or insulted needlessly, it cannot defend itself, for its father is never there to protect it, so that whoever imagines himself able to establish a clear and durable doctrine by the written word alone is a great fool. If he did possess the real seeds of truth, he would take great care not to believe that, with a little bit of black liquid in a pen, he can make them take root among men, protect them against inclement weather, and induce in them strong growth. As for the man who undertakes to write laws or civil constitutions, imagining that, because he has written them down, he has been able to give them proper clarity and stability, he disgraces himself whatever he is, whatever private citizen or legislator, and whatever men say, for he has thereby shown that he is equally ignorant of inspiration and madness, justice and injustice, good and evil. Such ignorance is disgraceful, even if he has the applause of the whole of the vulgar masses. Having heard the wisdom of nations, it will be useful, I think, to listen to Christian philosophy. Quote, doubtless it would be most desirable, the most eloquent of Greek fathers has said, for us to have had no need of writing, and for the divine precepts to have been written only in the hearts by grace, as they are written by ink in our books. But as we have lost this grace through our own fault, let us then by necessity seize a plank in place of a ship, without forgetting, however, the superiority of the first state. God never revealed anything to the elect of the Old Testament. He always talked to them directly, for he saw the purity of their hearts. But once the Hebrew people were thrown into the abyss of vice, books and laws became necessary. This, of course, resumed the influence of the new revelation, for Christ did not leave a single writing to his apostles. In place of books he promised them the Holy Spirit. It is it, he said to them, that will inspire what you will have to say. But because in the course of time guilty men revolted against dogmas and morality, it was necessary to resort to books. The whole truth is to be found in these two authorities. They showed the profound stupidity. It is permissible to talk like Plato, who never lost his temper. The profound stupidity, as I say, of those poor people who imagine that the legislators are men, that laws are pieces of paper, and that nations can be created by ink. They show, to the contrary, that writing is always a sign of weakness, ignorance, and danger, that the most perfect of institutions, the less it writes, so that the institution, which is certainly divine, has no written document as its basis, showing us that every written law is only a necessary evil produced by human infirmity or malice, and that it is nothing at all if it has not received a previous unwritten sanction. It is here one must grieve over the fundamental fallacy of a system that has so unfortunately divided Europe. The partisans of the system have said, "We believe only in the word of God." What an abuse of words! What a strange fatal ignorance of divine works! We alone believe in the spoken word, while our dear enemies persist in believing only in written words, as if God could or would have changed the nature of things that he ordained and invested writing with a life and efficacy that it had not. Is it not then the Holy Scripture written? Has it not produced by a pen in a little black liquid? Does it know what must be said to one man and hidden from another? Did not Leibniz and his servant read there the same words? Can this writing be other than the portrait of the Word? And although infinitely worthy of regard in this respect, does it not need to maintain a divine silence? Finally, if it is attacked or insulted, can it defend itself in the absence of its Father? Glory be to truth! If the eternal living spoken word does not give life to writing, it will never become the word, that is to say, life. Let others then invoke as much as they like the silent word. We shall peacefully laugh at this false god, ever writing with little gentle impatience for the moment when its partisans will leave their illusions and throw themselves in our arms, extended now for 3 centuries. Every right-thinking person will end by being convinced on this point, however little he reflects on an axiom equally striking in its importance and universality. This is that nothing great has great beginnings. No exception to this law will be found in the whole of history. Crescedit occulutu velut arbor vevo. This is the eternal motto of every great institution, and it follows that every false institution writes a great deal, and it is sensible to its weakness and seeks to buttress itself. From this truth results the inevitable consequence that no great real institution can be founded on a written law, since men find themselves successive instruments of the institution, do not know what it is to become, and since gradual growth is the true sign of durability in every possible order of things. A remarkable example of this is to be found in the power of the sovereign pontiffs, whom I do not intend to consider here in a dogmatic light. Since the 16th century, a host of scholars has made prodigious efforts at erudition to establish, by going to the earliest days of Christianity, that the bishops of Rome were not in the first centuries what they have since become, thus assuming as an agreed point that everything that is not found in primitive ages is an abuse. However, and I say this in no spirit of contention and without meaning to shock anyone, they show in as much philosophy and true learning as if they sought in a babe the arms, the real dimensions of a full-grown man. The sovereignty which I am now talking was born like others and has grown like others. It is pitiful to see powerful minds straining themselves to prove that maturity is an abuse by citing infancy, whereas the great idea of an institution being adult at birth is essentially an absurdity, a true logical contradiction. If the enlightened and generous enemies of this power, and certainly it has many of this kind, look at the question from this point of view, as I beg them with respect to do, I have no doubt that all of these objections draw from antiquity will vanish before their eyes like mist. As for abuses, I must not spend time on them here. I shall say only, since I have raised the subject, that there is plenty to rebut the declarations that the last century has given us this great subject. A time will come when the popes about whom there is the most protest, such as Gregory VII, for example, will everywhere be regarded as the friends, teachers, and saviors of mankind, as the true constituent geniuses of Europe. No one will doubt this once French intellectuals have become Christian and English intellectuals have become Catholic, which must assuredly come one day. But what penetrating words can we now use to make ourselves heard in an age infatuated with writing and suspicious of the spoken word, to the point of believing that men can create constitutions, languages, and even sovereignties, in a century for which every reality is a falsehood, and every falsehood a reality, which does not see even what is happening beneath its eyes, which feeds on books and goes to seek ambiguous lessons in Thucydides and Titus Livius, while entirely closing their eyes to the truth that shines in the newspapers of the time. If the wishes of a common mortal were worthy of obtaining from Providence, one of the memorable decrees which shaped the great crisis of history, I would ask it to inspire in some powerful nation that had offended it gravely the arrogant intention on constituting itself politically, starting at the very foundations. If in spite of my unworthiness I was allowed the ancient intimacy of the patriarchs, I would say, granted everything, give it spirit, knowledge, wealth, courage, above all an unlimited confidence in itself, and that adaptable and enterprising genius which is not checked or intimidated by anything. Wipe out its ancient government, take away its memory, slay its affections, spread terror around it, blind or freeze its enemies, arrange for it to be victorious on all frontiers at once, so that none of its neighbors can meddle in its affairs or trouble it in its plans. Let this nation be distinguished in science, rich in philosophy, sated with human power, free from all prejudices, all ties, every superior influence, lest one day it might be able to say, I lacked this, or I was hampered by that. Finally, let it act freely with this plenitude of means, so that it becomes, under your unfailing protection, an eternal lesson for humanity. Doubtless, one cannot expect a conjunction of circumstances, which would literally be a miracle, but events with a similar order, if less remarkable, have shown themselves here and there in history, even in the history of our own day, and although they have not, to serve as an example, that ideal force that I just now asked for, nonetheless, they point to some important lessons. Less than 25 years ago, we witnessed a serious attempt to regenerate a great but mortally sick nation. This was the first draft of a great work, and the preface, so to speak, of the frightening book that we have since to read. Every precaution had been taken. Alas, all human wisdom was at fault, and everything ended in death. It has been said, but we know the causes of the failure of the undertaking. How so? Do you want God to send angels in human's form, charged with destroying a constitution? It will always be very necessary for secondary agents to be employed. This or that, what does it matter? Every tool is useful in the hands of the great craftsman. But so blind are men that if tomorrow some constitution mongers came again to organize a people and to constitute it with a little bit of black liquid, the crowd would again lose no time in believing in the promised miracle. Once more, it would be said nothing is lacking, all is foreseen, all is written, whereas the very fact that all had been foreseen, discussed, and written would demonstrate the worthlessness and insubstantiability of the Constitution. I think I have read somewhere that there are very few sovereignties able to justify the legitimacy of their origins. Admitting the justice of this claim, it does not imply the least blemish on the successors of a ruler against whose actions many objections might be raised. The shadows, which a greater or lesser degree fall across the origins of his authority, should be regarded only as an inconvenience, a necessary consequence of a law of the moral world. If it were otherwise, it would follow that a sovereign could reign legitimately only by virtue of a deliberation of the whole people, that is to say, by grace of the people, which will never happen, for nothing is more true than that had been said by the author of Considerations on France, that people will always accept masters and will never choose them. It is always necessary for the origin of sovereignty to appear as being outside the sphere of human control, so that the very men who appear to be directly involved are nevertheless only circumstances. As for legitimacy, if it seemed ambiguous in the beginning, God has explained himself through his prime minister in the affairs of the world, time. It is nevertheless quite true that certain contemporary portents do not mislead us much when we are in the position to observe them, but the details of this will be followed through in another work. Everything therefore brings us back to the general rule. Man cannot make a constitution, and no legitimate constitution can be written. The corpus of fundamental laws that must constitute a civil or religious society have never been and never will be written. This can be done only when society is already constituted, Yet it is impossible to spell out or explain in writing certain individual articles, but almost always these declarations are the effect or cause of a very great evil, and they always cost people more than they are worth. To this general rule that no constitution can be written or made a priori, only one exception is known. That is the law of Moses. It alone was, so to speak, cast like a statue, and written down to the smallest detail by a prodigy, who said, "Let it be," without his work ever having been corrected, made good, or modified, either by himself or by others. But since every constitution is divine in origin, it follows that man cannot do anything unless he relies on God, in which case he has constantly rendered the most striking witness. If we refer to history, which is experimental politics, we shall see there continually the cradle of nations surrounded by priests, and here a constant call to God for help in human weakness. Myth, much truer than ancient history for trained eyes, adds to this proof. It is always an oracle who founds communities. It is always an oracle who announces divine protection and successes of the founding heroes. Above all kings, leaders of nascent empires are continually designed and almost stamped by heaven in the same extraordinary way. How many frivolous men have laughed at the holy ampulla without thinking that it is a hieroglyphic which only needs interpreting? The coronation of kings springs from the same roots. There has never been a ceremony, or more properly a profession of faith, more significant and worthy of respect. The finger of the pontiff has always touched the brow of the new sovereign. The many writers who have seen in those august rites nothing but ambitious designs, and even the open alliance of superstition and tyranny, have spoken against truth, almost all even against their conscience. This subject merits examination. Sometimes sovereigns have sought coronation, and sometimes coronations have sought sovereigns. Others have been seen to reject coronation as a sign of dependence. We know enough of these facts to be able to judge sufficiently soundly, but it would be necessary to distinguish carefully between different men, periods, nations, and religions. Here it is sufficient to insist on the general and universal opinion, which invokes the divine power in the establishment of empires. The most famous nations of antiquity, above all the most serious and wisest, such as the Egyptians, the Etruscans, the Spartans, and the Romans, were precisely those with the most religious constitutions. And the length of the empires has always been proportionate to the influence that the religious principle has acquired in the political system. The towns and nations most devoted to a cult of divinity have always been the most durable and the wisest, just as the most religious ages have always been the most distinguished by genius. Nations have never been civilized except by religion. No other force known has a hold on primitive man. Without recourse to antiquity, which is very decisive on this point, we see a striking proof of it in America. We have been there for 3 centuries with our laws, arts, sciences, culture, commerce, and wealth. How have we helped the indigenous population? In no way. We are destroying these unfortunate people with the sword and spirits. We are gradually pushing them back into the deserted interior until in the end they will be wiped out completely, the victims of our vices as much as our cruel superiority. Has any philosopher ever dreamed of leaving his native land and his pleasures to go into the American forest in chase of savages, to pry them from vice and give them a moral code? They have done much better. They have written splendid books to prove that the savage is the natural man, and that we can wish for nothing happier than to resemble him. Condorcet has said that the missionaries have carried into Asia and America only shameful superstitions. Rousseau has said, with a truly inconceivable compounding of folly, that the missionaries seemed to him scarcely wiser than the conquerors. Finally, their leader has had the impudence, but what had he to lose, to throw the most vulgar ridicule of these pacific conquerors, of whom antiquity would have made gods. These are, however, the very missionaries who have worked such remarkable wonders over human power and even over human will. They alone have traversed the vast American continent from one end to the other to raise the human spirit. They alone have done what politics had not even dared to imagine. But none of them can equal the missions of Paraguay. There has seen the most markedly exclusive power and authority of religion in cultivating men. This prodigious effort has been praised not sufficiently. The spirit of the 18th century and another accessory spirit have managed to stifle, in part, the voice of justice and even that of admiration. Perhaps one day, since it can be hoped that great noble works will again be taken up, in the heart of some affluent town set in an old savanna, a statue will be raised to the Father and to those missionaries. One will be able to read on its pedestal, "To the Christian Osiris, whose envoys have traversed the earth to snatch men from misery, from savagery and from brutality, by teaching them the arts of agriculture, giving them laws, and showing them how to know and serve God, not by the force of arms, of which they had no need, but by gentle persuasion, moral songs, and the power of hymns, so they were believed to be angels." Now, when it is remembered that this legislating monastic order, which held sway in Paraguay by the sole authority of virtues and talents, without ever departing from the humblest submission to even the most distant legitimate authority, that this order, as I say, at the same time tackled in our own prisons, our hospitals, our leper colonies, all the most horrible and repulsive aspects of destitution, illness, and despair, that these same men, who went first call to sit the straw by the side of poverty, were at home in the most polished circles, that they went on the scaffolds to say the last words to the victims of human justice, and from these theaters of horror hastened into the pulpits to thunder before kings, that they brought the artist's brush to China, the telescope to our observatories, the orphan's lyre to the midst of savages, and they had educated the whole of Louis XIV's age, when it is remembered finally that a hateful coalition of perverse ministers, deleterious judges, and ignoble sectarians had been able in our time to destroy this amazing institution and to congratulate themselves on their deed, one can believe in that madman who exultantly stamped on a watch, saying to it, "That will stop you from making a noise." But what am I saying? A madman is not guilty. I have to dwell principally on the formation of empires as the most important subject, but all human institutions fall under the same rule, and all are useless or dangerous if they do not rest upon foundations of all existence. This principle being incontestable, what are we to think of a generation that has thrown everything into confusion, down to the very basis of the social structure, in making education purely scientific? It would be impossible to make a more serious mistake, for every educational system that does not rest on religion will fall in the twinkling of an eye, or will disgorge nothing but poison into the state. Religion being, as Bacon has well put it, the preservative that saves sciences from putrefaction. It is often asked why there is a school of theology in every university. The reply is easy. It is so that the universities will continue to exist and that teaching will not corrupt itself. Originally, there were only schools of theology, which other faculties joined like subjects around a queen. The structure of public education resting on this base lasted until our day. Those who have overturned it in their countries will represent it vainly for a long time. To burn a town, only a child or a madman is needed. To rebuild it, architects, materials, workmen, money, and above all, time are necessary. Those who have been happy to corrupt old institutions while preserving their external form have perhaps done as much damage to mankind. Already the influence of modern universities on morals and national spirit in a considerable part of the European continent is widely recognized. In this respect, the English universities have retained more reputation than the others, perhaps because the English know better when it is proper to be silent and when to be satisfied. Perhaps also because public opinion, which has an extraordinary power in that country, has been able to protect these ancient colleges from the general disease better than elsewhere. However, they must go under, and already the evil heart of Gibbon has yielded some strange secrets to us on this point. In short, not to leave generalities, if one does not rely on ancient maxims, if education is not given to the priests, if science is not put everywhere in second place, the evils that await us are incalculable. We shall be brutalized by sciences, and that constitutes the lowest point of brutalization. Not only is creation not one of man's proper functions, it does not seem as if unassisted power extends to the reform of established institutions. Nothing is plainer to man than the existence of two opposed forces which ceaselessly battle in the universe. There is no good that evil does not defile and debase. There is no evil that good does not restrain and attack, in impelling all things towards a perfect state. These two forces are everywhere present. They have been seen equally in growth of plants, in the generation of animals, in the formation of languages and empires, two inseparable things, and so on. Human power extends perhaps only to removing or combating evil, to free the good from it, and to restore the good the power to grow according to its nature. The celebrated Zantoni said, "It is difficult to change things for the better." This thought hides a profound meaning under the appearance of an extreme simplicity. It accords completely with other things said of Origen, which is alone worth a whole volume. Nothing, he said, can be changed for the better in social matters without divine help. All men feel the truth of this without being able themselves to express it. It is from this that follows the unconscious aversion of all right-thinking men to innovations. The word reform in itself, and before any scrutiny, will always be suspect to the wise, and the experience of every age justifies this kind of instinct. It is well known what has been the fruit of the finest speculations in this line. To apply these generalizations to a particular case, it is from the sole consideration of the grave danger of innovations based on simplified human theories, without believing that I am in a position to hold a reasoned opinion on the great question of parliamentary reform, which has so deeply and for so long a time stirred English minds. I nevertheless feel led to believe that this idea is dangerous, and that if the English surrender to it readily, they will repent of it. But say of the partisan reform, for this is the great argument, the abuses are striking and incontestable. Can a formal abuse of vice be constitutional? Indisputably, it can be, for every political constitution has its essential faults, which spring from its nature, and which cannot be separated from it. And what should make every reformer hesitate is that these faults can change with circumstances, so that by showing that they are new, one has not thus shown that they are not necessary. What sensible man will not therefore be scared to undertake such work? Social harmony is subject to the law of temperament, as is harmony properly speaking in the musical scale. Get the fifths carefully in tune, and the octaves will clash, and vice versa. Discord being therefore inevitable, rather than removing it, which is impossible, it is necessary to temper it by disturbing it. Thus, in both cases, fault is an element in possible perfection. This proposition is only apparently paradoxical, but it will perhaps still be said, what is the rule to distinguish an accidental fault from that which belongs to the nature of things, and which is impossible to eliminate? Men to whom nature has given only ears put this kind of question, and those with an ear for music shrug their shoulders. It is still more necessary to take care, when it is a question of abuses, to judge political institutions only by their constant effects and never by any of their causes, still less by certain collateral disadvantages, if it can be so expressed, which can easily engross short-sighted views and prevent them from seeing things as a whole. In fact, cause, according to the hypothesis that seems to be proved, not having any necessary logical relation to effect, and the drawbacks of a good institution in itself being, as I have just said, only the necessary discord in the musical sense, how can institutions be judged on the basis of their causes and disadvantages? Voltaire, who talked of everything for a whole age, without once piercing below the surface, reasoned curiously on the sale of judicial offices, which took place in France, and perhaps no example could show more accurately the truth of the theory I am expounding. The proof, he said, that this sale is an abuse is that it has been produced only by another abuse. Voltaire is not merely mistaken here, since all men are liable to error. He is shamefully mistaken. This is a complete reversal of common sense. Everything that springs from an abuse is an abuse. On the contrary, it is one of the most general and evident of the laws of the hidden yet apparent power which operates and makes itself felt on all sides, that the remedy for an abuse springs from the abuse itself, and that an evil, carried to a certain point, is necessarily its own destroyer. For evil, which is no more a negative, has the same dimension and duration as the being to which it is attached, and which it devours. It is like a cancer, which can fulfill itself only by destroying itself. But then a new reality necessarily rushes into the place of that which has just disappeared, since nature abhors a vacuum, and good, but I am wandering too far from Voltaire. The error of this man comes from the fact that this great writer, divided between 20 sciences, as he has somewhere said himself, and moreover continually occupied with instructing the world, had only very rarely the time to think. A voluptuous spendthrift court, reduced to the extremities by its wastefulness, conceived the idea of selling judicial offices, and thus created, what it would never have done freely and with full knowledge, it created, I say, a rich, immovable, and independent judiciary. In this very way, the infinite power, playing over the world, makes use of corruption to create incorruptible courts, as much as it allows human weakness. In truth, nothing is more plausible than this to a true philosopher. Nothing conforms more to human experience and to the indisputable law which lays down that the most important institutions are never the result of deliberation, but of circumstances. The problem is now almost resolved when it is posed, as happens to every problem. Could a country such as France be better served than by hereditary judges? If this is agreed, as I assume, it immediately becomes necessary to propose a second problem like this. The judiciary being necessarily hereditary, is there a more advantageous method of constituting it in the first place, and subsequently of recruiting to it, than that which adds millions, the very least, to the state funds, and what guarantees at the same time the wealth, the independence, and even the nobility of every kind of the higher judiciary? If the sale of offices is considered only as a means of making them hereditary, every impartial mind is struck by the truth of this view. This is not the place to develop the point, but enough has been said to show that Voltaire did not even see it. Let us now suppose at the head of affairs a man such as he, combining in perfect harmony superficiality, incapacity, and temerity. He will not fail to act according to his foolish theories of laws and abuses. He will borrow to the last halfpenny to reimburse office holders, to the last shilling to reimburse creditors. He will prepare the public mind by paying for a host of writings insulting the judiciary and sapping public confidence in it. Soon, patronage, 1,000 times more foolish than chance, will begin its endless career of folly. The man of distinction, no longer seeing in heredity a counterweight to overwhelming labors, will stand down forever, and the high courts will be open to adventurers without name, wealth, or reputation, in place of that respected judiciary in which virtue and knowledge had become, like rank and heredity, a true priesthood, envied by foreign nations up to the time when the cult of philosophy, having excluded wisdom from all the places it used to visit, ended its splendid exploits by expelling them from its true home. This is a true reflection of the majority of reforms, because not only does creation not belong to man, but even reformation belongs to him only in a secondary manner, and with a host of severe restrictions. Starting from the incontestable principles, each man can judge his country's institutions with complete certainty. Above all, he can appreciate all those creators, those legislators, those restorers of nations so dear to the 18th century, whom posterity will regard with pity, perhaps even with horror. Houses of cards have been built both in and outside of Europe. Details would be odious, but certainly no disrespect is shown to anyone by simply asking men to deliberate and judge, at least on the basis of events, even if they persist in refusing any other kind of instruction. Man in harmony with his creator is sublime, and his action creative. Equally, once he separates himself from God and acts alone, he does not cease to be powerful, since this is his privilege of nature, but his acts are negative and lead only to destruction. In the whole of humanity, there is not a single fact that contradicts these maxims. No human institution can last if it is not supported by the hand which supports all things. That is to say, if it is not specially consecrated to him in its origins. The more it is penetrated by the divine principle, the more durable it will be. How curiously blind are the men of our age! They boast of their enlightenment, and are totally ignorant, since they know nothing of themselves. They know neither what they are, nor what they can do. A boundless pride leads them continually to overthrow everything they have not themselves made, and to bring about new creations. They cut themselves off from the principles of all existence. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, however, has himself very well said, "Petty and vain man, confess to me your weakness, and I will show you your strength." In fact, once man has recognized his incapacity, he has taken a great step forward, for he is then very near to seeking a support with which he can do all things. This is precisely the opposite of what the last century did. Alas, it has ended only in our calendars. Examine all its undertakings, any of its institutions, and you will see it constantly engaged in separating them from the divinity. Man believed himself to be an independent being, and professed a real practical atheism, more dangerous and perhaps more culpable than a theoretical atheism. Distracted by its vain sciences from the only science that really concerns him, he believed that he had the power of creation, whereas he does not even have that of naming. He, who has not the power even of making an insect or a blade of grass, believed that he was the immediate author of sovereignty, the most important sacred and fundamental thing in the moral and political world, and that, for example, such and such a family reigns because such and such a people has willed it, while he is surrounded by incontrovertible proofs that every sovereign family reigns because it is chosen by a superior family. If he does not see the proofs, it is because he closes his eye or scrutinizes too closely. He believed that it is he who invented languages, whereas again, all that lies with him is to see that every human language is learned and never invented, and that no conceivable hypothesis based on human power can explain, with the least appearances of probability, either the formation or diversity of languages. He believed that he could constitute nations, that is to say, in other words, that he could create the national unity by virtue of which one nation is indistinguishable from another. Finally, he believed that, since he had the power of creating institutions, he had, with greater reason, the power of borrowing them from other nations and transplanting them, ready-made, into his own country, with the name that they had abroad, to enjoy them like those foreigners with the same advantages. French sources provide me with an apt example on this point. Several years ago, the French took it into their hands to establish in Paris certain races that were seriously called, in some writings of the day, Olympic Games. The reasoning of those who invented or received this splendid name was not subtle. They were, they said to themselves, foot and horse races on the back of the Alpheus. There are foot and horse races on the banks of the Seine, so it is the same thing. Nothing could be simpler, but without asking them why they did not think of calling these games Parisian Games instead of Olympic, there would be many other observations to make. To initiate the Olympic Games, oracles were consulted. Gods and heroes played a part in them. They were never started without sacrifices, and other religious ceremonies being performed. They were regarded at the great public assemblies of Greece, and nothing was more dignified. But did the Parisians, before they set up their races, revived from the Greeks, go to Rome, ad limina apostolorum, to consult the Pope? Before starting off their daredevils to amuse the shopkeepers, did they sing a high mass? What great political viewpoint had they been able to associate with these races? What names were given to their founders? But this is more than enough. The most ordinary good sense at once feels the meaninglessness and even the absurdity of the imitation involved. For myself, I believe, and indeed I know, that no human institution can last if it is not a religious base, and moreover, I beg that particular attention be paid to this, if it is not a name taken from the national language and self-generated without any previous or known deliberation. The theory of names is again a subject of great importance. Names are not purely arbitrary, as has been claimed by so many men who have lost their own names. God calls himself I Am, and every creature is called I Am so-and-so. Since the name of a sacred being is necessarily relative to its function, which is its distinctive quality, it follows that among the ancients the greatest honor for God was polynemy, that is to say, a plurality of names, which gives proof of a plurality of functions, or extensive power. Ancient mythology shows us Diana, while still a child, demanding this honor from Jupiter, and in the verse attributed to Orpheus, she is complimented by the name of Daemon Polynomen, spirit of many names, which means, at bottom, that God alone has the right to bestow a name. Indeed, he has named everything, since he has created everything. He gave names to the stars, he named the angels, and of these last names, Scripture mentions only 3, but all 3 are related to the intended purpose of these agents. It is the same with men whom God wished to name himself, and whom Scripture has made known to us in a sufficiently large number. In every case, names are related to functions. Has it not been said that in his kingdom to come he would give to the visitors a new name, suited to their deeds? And have men, made in the image of God, found a more solemn way of rewarding victors than by giving them a new name? The most honorable of all beings in men's eyes, the name of the vanquished nations. Whenever a man is supposed to change his way of life and to assume a new character, very often he receives a new name. This is revealed in baptism, in confirmation, in the enrollment of soldiers, in the entry into religious orders, in the enfranchisement of slaves, and so on and so on. In a word, the name of every being expresses what he is, and in this way there is nothing arbitrary about it. The common expression, he has a name, he has no reputation, il a un nom, il n'a point de nom, is very apt and meaningful, for no man can be placed among those called to assemblies, and who have a name, if his family is not marked with the sign that distinguishes it from other families. What is true for individuals is true for nations. There are those that have no name, in either sense. Herodotus observed that Thracians would have been the most powerful nation in the world had they been united. But, he adds, this unity is impossible because they are divided into groups with different names. This is an acute remark. There are also modern nations which have no name, and there are others which have several. But polymony is unfortunate for nations, as it was believed to be honorable for gods. Names, therefore, being far from arbitrary and being derived in their origin, like all things, more or less immediately from God. It should not be, though, that man has the right to name without restriction, even those things of which he has some right to regard himself as the author, and to impose names on them according to the idea he has formed of them. God has reserved for himself in this respect a kind of original jurisdiction, impossible to ignore. My dear Hermogenes, the imposition of names is an important matter, and cannot belong to the evil, or even common man. This right belongs to the maker of names, that is to say, as it seems, to the legislator alone, but a legislator is the rarest of all human beings. However, man likes nothing so much as to give names. That is what he does. For example, when he applies conventional epitaphs to things, a talent which distinguishes a great writer and above all a great poet. The happy imposition of an adjective renders a noun illustrious, makes it celebrated in the new combination. Man will never lose the memory of his original powers. It cannot even be said that, in a certain sense, he will always exercise them. But how much has his degradation restricted them? Here is a law true as God who made it. It is forbidden to man to give great names to things of which he is the author, and which he believes to be great. But if he has acted legitimately, the great thing will ennoble the vulgar name and will become great itself. Another reason, which if less important still has its value, must oblige us to mistrust all pretentious names imposed a priori. It is that man's conscience, almost always warning him against imperfection of the work he has just produced, rebellious pride, while it cannot mislead itself, seeks at least to mislead others by inventing an honorable name that assumes precisely the opposite merit, so that this name, instead of giving true witness to the excellence of the work, is really confession of the blemish that characterizes it. But as I have said, all this is only secondary. Let us return to the general principle that man has not, or has no longer, the right to name things, at least in the sense I have given. What is especially significant is that the names most worthy of respect have in every language an origin in common speech. The name is never adapted to the thing itself. In every case, the thing adds luster to the name. The name must grow, so to speak, otherwise it is inappropriate. What does the word throne mean originally? A seat, or even a stool. What does a scepter mean? A walking stick. But the stick of kings was soon distinguished from all others, and this name, in its new meaning, has lasted for 3,000 years. Is there anything nobler in literature, and yet humbler in its origin, than the word tragedy? And the now almost striking word flag, raised ennobled by warriors' lances. What a varied fate has that had in our own language! Many other words come in varying degrees to support the same principle, such as, for example, senate, dictator, consul, emperor, church, cardinal, marshal. Let us end by considering the names constable and chancellor given to two high offices of modern times. The first meant originally only the keeper of the stables, and the second the man who stood behind a grill, as to not be overwhelmed by a crowd of supplicants. There are therefore two infallible rules for judging all human creations, whatever they may be: origin and name, and properly understood, these two rules are easily applied. If the origin is purely human, the structure must be unsound. The more human interference, the greater the role of deliberation, science, and above all, writing, in a word of human means of every kind, the more fragile will be the institution. It is primarily by this rule that the work of kings or assemblies in civilizing, establishing, or regenerating nations must be judged. For the opposite reason, the more divine an institution in its origins, the more durable it is. It is well to point out, for the sake of clarity, that the religious principle is in essence creative and conservative, in two ways. In the first place, as it is the most effective influence on the human mind, it can stimulate prodigious efforts. So, for example, a man persuaded by his religious belief that it is very advantageous to him that after his death his body should be preserved as far as possible as it was in life, without any prying or profane hand being able to touch it, such a man, having brought the art of embalmment to perfection, will end by constructing the pyramids of Egypt. In the second place, the religious principle, already strong because of what it effects, is still stronger because of what it prevents, through the respect with which it surrounds everything it takes under its wings. If a pebble is consecrated, that immediately becomes a reason for keeping it from those who might mislay or misuse it. The word is full of proofs of this truth. For example, Etruscan vases preserved by the sanctity of the tomb have, in spite of their fragility, come down to us in greater numbers than marble or bronze statues of the same period. If therefore you wish to conserve all, consecrate all. The second rule, that of names, is to my mind neither less clear nor less decisive than the first. If a name is imposed by an assembly, if it is established by previous deliberation, so that it precedes the thing to which it applies, if the name is pompous, if it is portentous as the object it should represent, finally, if it is taken from a foreign language, and especially an ancient language, it is completely useless, and both the name and the thing it stands for will certainly disappear in a short time. The opposite conditions are a mark of the legitimacy and consequently the durability of the institution. It is very necessary to guard against dealing with this subject superficially. The true philosopher must never lose sight of language, a barometer that registers faithfully good and bad weather. To keep my present subject, the unlimited introduction of foreign words, above all when applied to national institutions of every kind, is certainly one of the surest signs of a people's degradation. If the formation of empires, the progress of civilization, and the unanimous agreement of all history and tradition is still not sufficient to convince us, the death of empires will complete the proof begun by their birth. Just as it was the religious principle that has created all things, so it is the absence of the same principle that has destroyed all things. Epicureans, who could be called the ancient unbelievers, first degraded and soon destroyed every government which had the misfortune to tolerate them. Everywhere, Lucretius heralded Caesar. But all past experiences dwindles to nothing beside the astounding example furnished by the last century. Still drunk with its heady fumes, men in general are far from having sufficient composure to look at the example in its true light, and especially to draw from it necessary conclusions. It is therefore essential to scrutinize this terrible epoch with every care. There have always been religions in this world, and there have always been the ungodly to fight them. Also, blasphemy has always been a sin, for since every false religion must contain some element of truth, every blasphemous doctrine must attack some divine truth, more or less distorted. But true blasphemy can only exist in the bosom of a true religion, and inevitably blasphemy has never been able to produce in the past the evils it has produced in our own day, for its culpability is always relative to the general standard of enlightenment. It is by this rule that the 18th century must be judged, for it is from this point of view that it differs from every other. It is often said that every age is alike and that all men have always been the same. But it is very necessary to guard against believing these generalizations, invented by laziness or superficiality to escape from real thought. On the contrary, every age and every nation has a particular and distinctive character, which must be carefully considered. No doubt there have always been vices in the world, but these vices can differ in quantity, in nature, and in dominant quality and in intensity. Although there has always been impiety, there has never been, before the 18th century, and in the heart of the Christian world, an insurrection against God. Above all, there had never been seen before a sacrilegious conspiracy of all talents against their author. Now this is what we have seen in our own day. Comedy has vied with tragedy in blasphemy, and the novel with history and natural philosophy. The men of this age have prostituted their talents to irreligion, and, to use the admirable phrase of the dying St. Louis, they have waged war against God with his own gifts. The impiety of the ancient world is never angry. Sometimes it is reasonable. Ordinarily it is light-hearted. But it is never bitter. Even Lucretius scarcely descends into an insult, and although his somber melancholy temperament leads him to see things in their darkest color, yet even when he attacks religion for having produced great evils, he remains composed. The ancient religions were not sufficiently worthwhile to merit the anger of contemporary skeptics. When the good tidings were proclaimed to the world, the attack became more violent, yet its enemies always kept within certain limits. Only occasionally do they appear in history, and then always isolated. There is never any combination or formal alliance. Never did they unleash the fury that we have witnessed. Even Bayle, the father of modern skepticism, does not resemble the slightest of his successors. In his most flagrant errors, he shows no spirit of proselytization, still less any tone of irritation or partisan spirit. He denies less than he doubts. He gives argument for and against. Often he speaks even more eloquently for the good than for the bad cause. It was not therefore until the first half of the 18th century that irreligion really became a force. At once it spread everywhere, with incredible speed. From the palace to the cabin, it crept everywhere and infected everything. It followed secret channels, and had hidden but effective action, so that the closest observer, although he sees the effects, cannot always discover the causes. But its enormous prestige made itself loved, even by those of whom it was the deadliest enemy. and the authority which it was about to destroy stupidly embraced it before receiving the death blow. Soon a simple theory became a formal association, which rapidly graduated to a conspiracy and finally into a great organization covering Europe. Then, for the first time, the unique character of the 18th century atheism revealed itself. It no longer speaks in the cold tone of indifference, still less with the biting irony of skepticism. There is a deadly hatred, a tone of anger, and often fury. The writers of this age, at least the most outstanding, no longer treat Christianity as an inconsequential human error, but hunt it like a mortal enemy. It becomes a fight to the end, a war to the death, and what would seem unbelievable, if we did not have sad proofs of it before our eyes, is that many of the self-styled philosophers raise their hatred of Christianity to a personal hatred of its divine author. They really detest him as a living enemy is detested. Two men, above all, who will forever be cursed by posterity, have distinguished themselves by a kind of wickedness which might seem beyond the powers of even the most depraved human nature. However, the whole of Europe having been civilized by Christianity, and its ministers having gained an important place in the politics of every country, civil and religious institutions had been intermingled, and almost amalgamated to a surprising degree, so that it could be said, with more or less truth of every European state, what Gibbon had said of France, that this kingdom had been made by bishops. It was therefore inevitable that the philosophy of the age did not hesitate to vilify the social institutions identified with the religious principle. This is what happened. Every government and institution in Europe displeased it, precisely because they were Christian, and in proportion to the influence of Christianity, a malaise of opinion, a general discontentment seized men's minds. In France especially, this philosophical fury no longer recognized any limits, and soon many voices were joined in one chorus, which was heard at the hearts of sinful Europe. Depart from us, God! Must we forever tremble before priests and receive from them whatever instruction they care to give us? Throughout Europe, truth is hidden by the smoke of incense. It is time that it emerged from that fatal cloud. We shall no longer speak of you to our children. It is for them, when they become men, to decide if you are what you are and what you ask of them. All things displease us, because your name is written on all things. We wish to destroy everything, and to recreate it without your help. Depart from our councils of state, our schools, our homes. We shall be better off alone. Reason will be a sufficient guide. Depart from us, God. How has God punished this abominable delirium? He has punished it as he created the world, by a single phrase. He has said, "Let it be," and the political world collapsed. This is how the two proofs joined to convince even the least far-seeing minds. On the one side, the religious principle presides over every political creation, and on the other, everything crumbles once it withdraws. Europe's sin is to have closed men's eyes to these great truths, and it is because it has sinned that it suffers. Yet it still rejects the true light and ignores the hand that punishes it. Very few men in this materialist generation are capable of knowing the time, the nature, and the enormity of certain crimes committed by individuals, nations, and sovereigns, still less of understanding the kind of expiation these crimes necessitate, and the wonderful miracle that forces evil to clean with its own hands the places that the eternal architect has already surveyed for his awesome works. The men of this age have made up their minds. They have sworn to bow their eyes to the earth, but it would be useless, perhaps even dangerous, to go into greater detail. We are enjoined to speak the truth in love. It is more necessary, on certain occasions, not to speak it except with respect, and in spite of every imaginable precaution. The way would be difficult for even the calmest and best intentioned of writers. The world, moreover, always holds an innumerable host of men, so perverse, so profoundly corrupted, that if they had been allowed to doubt certain things, they will also take the opportunity to redouble their wickedness, and make themselves, so to speak, as guilty as the rebel angels. Rather, let them grow more like brutes, if this is possible, so that, As less than men, their guilt will be the less. Blindness is no doubt a terrible punishment, yet sometimes it still allows the perception of love. This is all that can be said at this time.